They called me the most fortunate girl in the palace. Born under the blossom moon, draped in silk before I could speak. Promised to a man whose name stirred envy and awe in every corridor of court. Lady Yu Lian of the Eastern Pavilion. Daughter of Lord Yu Wen, commander of the Southern Fleet. Betrothed to Lord Rengier Yen, the Emperor's favored general, the son of a noble house, and the man I believed would be my forever. But no one asked what it felt like to be praised for a life you couldn't touch with your own hands. No one saw the hairline cracks in our golden hall, the way silence weighed heavier than words, or how my hands trembled when no one was watching. Because behind the veil of elegance, behind the painted smiles and choreographed bows, I already knew something was wrong. I remember the day the final marriage rites were announced. The blossoms had bloomed too early that year, a soft rebellion against tradition. Their petals danced down like silent messengers, blanketing the courtyard in fragile pink. I stood beneath the Empress's viewing balcony, my eyes lowered, my face still. The jade hairpins in my crown pinched my scalp with every breath, but I didn't flinch. Behind me, the other noble daughters whispered, their voices ribbons of envy. She's so calm. Look at her posture, like she was born to be empress one day. Rengier is lucky. Or is it the other way around? I wanted to tell them that being chosen didn't mean you were seen. That perfection was a mask we were taught to wear so well, it eventually fused to the skin. Rengier arrived late, as always. His stride was precise, his face unreadable, the steel of his armor polished, but not a single gesture offered in my direction. Not even a glance. Still, I bowed low when he approached, as protocol demanded, and when he spoke his vow, I answered mine like a melody I'd memorized long ago. But deep within, something coiled, quiet and sharp. A feeling I couldn't name yet. A whisper, maybe, or a warning. They say love grows in the quiet, in the shared glances, in the spaces between words. But what happens when there are no glances at all? At the nightly feast, I sat beside Rengier, dressed in robes of red and gold, the color of prosperity. He didn't touch the wine I poured, didn't respond to my soft questions, only nodded when the Emperor addressed him and bowed when my father praised his victories on the battlefield. I smiled. I lifted my cup. I played the part, because I had been raised to serve harmony, not stir waters. But when I looked across the table and met Jin Mion's gaze, my stepsister, my father's second wife's only daughter, she looked too pleased, too knowing. And Rengier, he looked at her, just for a second. But it was longer than he'd looked at me all night. Later, when the lanterns had dimmed and the guests retired to their pavilions, I sat alone beneath the moon, listening to the wind press against my paper walls. A servant girl brought me plum wine, her hands shaking slightly.
There was no order for wine, I said gently.
Her eyes widened, and she bowed so low I thought she might faint. Forgive me, my lady. Lady Mion said you requested it. My hand froze. I made no such request. I took the wine anyway, let it rest on the table untouched. And as I stared at it, crimson and silent in the cup, I knew this was not just about marriage anymore. Rengier visited me the next morning unannounced. He brought a scroll from the Ministry of War, pretending to ask my opinion on an imperial gift. A formality. We sat across from each other, tea between us, silence heavy. I asked him what he thought of the scroll. He deflected. I asked if he was well. He nodded once. Then he said, "You look well today, Lady Yu." Lady Yu. Not Yu Lian. Not even Liena, the name he'd once whispered in gardens years ago. A stranger's name. A title. A placeholder in a performance. I smiled because I had to, and when he left, I poured the untouched tea into the earth. Even the soil didn't want it. That night, I went to the garden pond, the one Mother had loved before she passed. The moonlight cast long shadows over the stone bridges. Lotuses floated like soft lanterns on the water. I knelt by the edge, letting my fingers skim the surface. And I whispered to the night, to the ghosts of the women who had come before me. If love is real, let it find me again. If betrayal is near, let me see it clearly. A wind rose.
Soft.
Then stronger. A petal landed on my palm, and in the ripples of the pond, I saw it. Two figures reflected in the distance. A man and a woman walking too close. The man with silver on his shoulders. The woman with a ribbon I knew too well. Mion's ribbon. 2 nights later, the palace held its mid-spring lantern festival. It was tradition for couples to send a shared wish into the sky, a prayer written together on silk and tied to a floating light. Rengier and I were handed our scroll by the Empress herself. She smiled at us like we were already the dynasty's future. "May you rise together always," she said. But when Rengier handed me the brush, he didn't look at me. And when he wrote his wish, he folded the paper too quickly for me to read. Still, we launched the lantern together. It drifted upward, golden and slow. Yet I couldn't help but glance sideways. And there, in the garden's edge, was Mion again, staring not at the sky, but at him. 3 days passed. Then 4. Rengier stopped visiting. No messages came. Lady Jeanne, my stepmother, took ill suddenly. Mion began attending court in her place. And I began to dream of fire. Crimson halls. Screams. A hand reaching for mine, then letting go. I woke each time with sweat on my neck and ash in my mouth. When I asked my maidservant to fetch medicine from the physician, she returned pale-faced. "The tonic was already ordered, my lady," she said. "Lady Mion sent for it on your behalf." Again. That name. That interference. I drank only water that day, and burned the tonic, without opening the lid. On the 8th night, I stood outside the grand pavilion before the Empress's private chambers. I waited until her other ladies-in-waiting had left. When she finally emerged, I bowed. "I do not come as your future daughter-in-law, your majesty," I said. "I come as your loyal servant." She looked at me long, and in that look, I felt something shift. "You are not what they think you are," she murmured. I didn't know who she meant, them or me, but I raised my head and whispered, "Then let them continue thinking." She smiled faintly, and gave me a name, the Northern House of Jean, an old rival of Rengier's father, but fiercely loyal to the Empress. And so I began to write. It was the night before the engagement banquet. I sat alone in my chamber, dressed in ceremonial white. The halls were quiet, too quiet. Then a knock. When I opened the door, there was no one. Only a small scroll tied in crimson ribbon. I unrolled it slowly. Only 2 words written in Rengier's hand. "Stay silent." And beneath that, smeared into the parchment, a small, dark stain.
Blood.
They believed I would crumble silently, that my lips, trained in gentleness, would never shape the word war. But war doesn't always begin with swords. Sometimes it begins with tea left untouched, with a glance too long, with a single word, written in blood. Stay silent. That was what Rengier warned, or threatened. I hadn't decided which it was yet, but I knew this. If they wanted a silent bride, I would become a quiet storm instead. Palace mornings are performances. Dancers rehearsing routine. Servants moving like calligraphy. But that morning, I walked the stone path with a new rhythm. Not soft, deliberate. The gossip had already begun. They said I had lost favor. That Rengier hadn't visited in over a week. That Lady Mion had been seen near the Southern War Council. I smiled at the murmurs. Let them bloom like poisonous flowers. They thought I would fade into embroidery and weeping poetry. But I was writing a new script. One where I wouldn't be the gentle girl watching from the wings. I would be the one holding the pen. The Empress summoned me for tea. Her pavilion was a sanctuary of silence. Orchids trembling in glass vases, koi swimming in round jade bowls. She poured the tea herself. That was answer enough. "You know," she said, watching the steam rise, "a woman's strength is not in her silence. It is in what she chooses to reveal, and when." "I see more than I speak," I replied. Her eyes, sharp like a blade sheathed in velvet, met mine. "And what have you seen, Lady Yu?" "I've seen loyalty twisted into poison. and desire hiding behind the face of duty. Her hand paused on the teacup. Then she said, softly, "Good. Now show me what else you can see." And she handed me a name. Jean Hyen, strategist of the North. Unmarried. Unaligned. But bitter toward House Yen. He would receive a letter that night, written in the Empress's ink, sealed in mine. I began leaving pieces of myself in places they wouldn't look. A dropped glove near the northern barracks. A book borrowed from the Ministry of Appointments. A conversation heard, then half repeated at the weaving hall. Each action was quiet.
Soft.
Forgettable on its own. But together, they became a map. To those who knew how to read it. Jean Hyen replied on the third day. A folded scroll, scented faintly with ink and mint. "I know what they've done," it said. "I have my reasons for helping you, but I will not protect you if you fall. Choose your next step carefully, Lady Yu." I didn't hesitate, because falling wasn't the danger anymore. It was staying still. In my chambers, I began building a ledger of betrayal. Not of emotions, those were too slippery. I wrote down movements, meetings, guards switched, gifts received, Mion's pattern of visits to Rengier's pavilion, Rengier's carriage slipping out at night when the moon was new. I learned the names of their servants, watched which ones avoided my eyes when passing. And most of all, I tracked the gaps, the silences that meant more than spoken words. One night, I followed a trail of incense to the back corridor near the treasury wing. There I heard laughter.
Low.
Intimate. Familiar. Rengier's voice. And hers.
Mion.
"Do you think she knows?" she whispered. "Not yet," he replied. "But soon." A pause. "When the time is right." They didn't dare use a blade. Not yet. So they used something slower. More polite. On the morning of the Emperor's inspection, I was presented a new hairpin set from Mion, silver with peony motifs. "A token of peace," she said sweetly. I wore it. But that night, my scalp itched. My skin flushed. And when I touched the pin again, my fingers burned. The physician said it was nothing. A reaction to spring pollen. But the Empress summoned a private alchemist. His findings were clear. "A rare resin from southern marshes," he whispered. "Undetectable in wine. But on skin, it inflames the nerves." I left the hairpin on her table. Didn't say a word. But the next morning, Mion appeared at court with gloves on.
So she knew that I knew.
And the game changed. I had spent most of my life being told what a woman should be. Gentle, obedient, graceful. But when I looked in the mirror now, I saw something different. My gaze was still soft, but it had edges. I smiled less often, but when I did, it meant more. I no longer asked if I was loved. I asked whether I was underestimated. That evening, I invited Mion for tea. In the pavilion where we used to play as children. She came, dressed in lavender, pretending nothing had happened. I poured the tea, with slow grace. "You know," I said, "some poisons are bitter. But the most dangerous ones taste like plum blossom." Her fingers twitched around the cup. I didn't touch mine. "I would never harm you, sister," she said, too quickly. I tilted my head. "Of course not. Why would you?" We smiled at each other. And every petal that fell between us was sharp as a knife. Because that answer could be used. Jean Hyen sent another letter. This one sealed with gold wax. "I've spoken with the Northern Warden. He's willing to back your claim, should you need to dissolve the engagement.
But
he underlined it twice. They will not accept emotion as reason. You need evidence." I knew what he meant. And I knew where to find it. Rengier's private quarters in the eastern wing housed a small library. His guards rotated every 2 hours. At midnight, cloaked in servant robes, I slipped inside. Among his scrolls, beneath a pile of military dispatches, I found it. A ledger of gifts exchanged with the Lady Jin family.
Dates.
Names. Even documents showing pre-approval of estate shares to Mion, should I pass, without an heir. It was a death wish written in ink. And I had just found my first weapon. The next day, I returned to the garden with my embroidery frame. But I stitched not flowers. I stitched names, hidden in silk, invisible unless you knew the pattern. The names of my betrayers. Because I had learned the truth. Sometimes revenge doesn't arrive with drums and fire. Sometimes it's carried on the breeze, in a letter slipped into a general's sleeve, in a smile traded with the Empress, in a teacup left untouched. They had begun a silent war. But I would finish it. And they would never hear me coming. I was born in fire. Not in the literal sense, no, that came later. But in the quiet sense, the way a candle flame learns to flicker even when the wind is gentle. And when it howls, it doesn't die. It dances. They thought I was too gentle to survive betrayal, too soft to rise, too loyal to notice the rope tightening around my neck. But I had watched every shadow, counted every poisoned smile, traced each step of their conspiracy as carefully as a dancer preparing for her final bow. And I bowed, right before I burned. The wedding was set for the summer solstice, a sacred date, symbol of light triumphing over darkness. Fitting, they said. How ironic. The halls were dressed in crimson and gold. I wore the robe of a future wife, a veil of red silk, embroidered with phoenixes. Underneath it, I was silent, but inside, I was already screaming, because the night before, I found the final piece, a letter, unsealed, misplaced on Rengier's desk in his rush to prepare. It wasn't addressed to me. It was to Mion. Once the fire is done, you will become Lady Yen. The lands and titles will be transferred by week's end. Our new life begins in ash. They didn't intend to kill me that day. Not in front of witnesses. They planned a private ceremony, citing traditional customs. Only close family. Only Rengier, Mion, and the Empress's absent blessing. But I knew, and so did she. The Empress sent me a single item, a hairpin of obsidian shaped like a blade. With it, a note. If they light a fire beneath your feet, remember, you are not made of wood. You are made of stars. So I dressed carefully. Not for a wedding, for war. They led me through the moonlit trail toward the ancestral shrine. No guards. No witnesses. Only Rengier's silent steps beside mine. Only Mion's perfume trailing behind. We reached the cliff's edge, the final altar before the sky. It was custom, they said, for a noble bride to offer her prayer to the ancestors on the edge of heaven. To kneel. To bow. To fall. Rengier's hand grazed my shoulder. And in a blink I was pushed. There are moments time forgets. Moments that do not belong to the living or the dead. Falling was one of them. The wind didn't scream. It whispered. Now. And I closed my eyes. Not to accept death. To choose it. Or rather, to choose what came after. They believed I had shattered on the rocks. That my body would never be found. They had prepared a fire. Lit it in the eastern pavilion. Burning my robes, my letters, my jewelry. The court mourned. My father wept, believing I had tripped on my own veil. The Empress wore white, but did not cry. Because she knew. And in a village deep within the mountains, an old healer woman watched over me. My ribs broken. My breath shallow. But my eyes burning. I saw the fire, she whispered. But you didn't burn. I stayed silent for 12 days. Not because I couldn't speak, but because words were unnecessary. Pain was my teacher. Silence was my ally. The villagers asked no questions. They cleaned my wounds with herbs I couldn't name. Fed me broth. Let me sleep under stars without names. And when I could finally sit again, the healer placed a mirror in my hands. You were not born to be pretty, she said. You were born to endure. I looked at my reflection. Pale, bruised, but awake. And I whispered for the first time, let them think I'm dead. On the 14th day, a merchant passed through the mountain path. He spoke of Lady Yu Lian's tragic death. How the eastern pavilion had burned with her inside. How Lord Rengier and Lady Mion announced their engagement only 7 nights later. A tragedy, he said. But life moves on. I thanked him with a quiet bow. Then went behind the hut and threw up until my stomach was empty. Not from pain. From fury. The healer gave me an old soldier's cloak. A sword too dull for war, but sharp enough for memory. You must leave before the snows come, she said. I nodded. I won't stay long, I told her. But I will return. For revenge. For rebirth. She smiled, the way only women who have died before can smile. Good, she said. Then take this. She handed me a ribbon of red silk. I recognized it. It was mine, rescued from the river below the cliff. Names can die, she said. But symbols live. And I tied it to my wrist. The girl they killed had died. But the woman who rose would remember everything. That night, I sat alone on the cliff's edge. Not the one I had fallen from, but a new one. Higher, colder. And I stared up at the stars, ancient, endless. The same ones that watched me fall. And I whispered to them, a vow written not in blood, but in breath. I am coming back, not to return what was taken, but to take what I was never given. Respect, justice, truth, and the power to choose who I become. The stars didn't answer. They didn't need to, because I no longer needed permission. Only time, and time was on my side. Death changes a woman. Not just her face, her breath, her pulse, her voice. It rewrites her soul. The mountain called me back to life. But I didn't return as Lady Yulian. That name had been burned. That girl had been buried. In her place stood someone else. Someone with eyes sharpened by betrayal, a spine straightened by grief, and a voice learned in silence. I returned not as a noble daughter, not as a lost fiancé, but as a ghost in silk, and I would haunt them one breath at a time. I entered the city through the northern gate. No fanfare, no procession, only the crunch of frost beneath my sandals, and a hood drawn low across my face. I wore travel robes. Gray, dusty, unremarkable. But underneath, I carried the obsidian hairpin the Empress had given me. Not as an accessory, as a promise. I had a new name. Lin Shuang, a widow from the mountain provinces. No lineage, no claim, a nobody. Exactly what I needed to be. To enter the palace again would be suicide. But the Empress had prepared a door. In the winter season, the palace took in temporary staff, healers, weavers, couriers. She ensured I was among them. I was assigned to the seamstress quarters, a simple needle in a room of quiet women and folded fabric. But the palace whispered in every corridor, and I listened. The guards had changed. So had the Empress's attendants. But the shadows? The shadows remembered me. They watched me pass, curious, suspicious, but never certain, because ghosts do not wear noble robes. Ghosts wear gray. On the fourth day I saw it, the Eastern Pavilion, my home, now repainted in new colors. Banners of House Yen flew above it. Lanterns of celebration still hung like rotting fruit. They had moved in quickly. Too quickly. Lady Mian had taken my place. She now walked where I once danced, smiled where I once ached. I watched her from behind a garden screen. She looked radiant, unscarred, but I could see the tremble in her hand as she lifted her tea. Could see the way her gaze flicked toward shadows. She felt it. She felt me, even if she didn't know why. My first assignment took me to the West Wing, to mend the Empress's winter robes. But it wasn't the robes she wanted mended. It was my fire. She dismissed her attendants. And when we were alone, she turned. Your silence is exquisite, she said, but your eyes are still too loud. I dropped to my knees. My apologies, Your Majesty. She approached, lifted my chin with 2 fingers. Don't apologize, she whispered. They buried you, Lien. But I see who rose. I didn't cry. There were no tears left. Only steel. Then you know why I've come, I said. She nodded, and slipped a sealed scroll into my sleeve. The House of Jean is watching, and your sword awaits. That night, I wrote a single letter. Not with ink, with vinegar and ash. Words that would vanish in moonlight. I sent it through a merchant to the northern provinces. To Jean Hyen. It read, The Phoenix lives. The blade will sing soon. Prepare the snow.
LS.
During daylight, I stitched brocade. At night, I trained in silence. A hidden shed behind the Empress's garden became my temple. The blade I'd been given was light, elegant, made for precision. The Empress's former guard captain, now retired and silent, became my teacher. He said little, only corrected my posture, stripped the fear from my hands, taught me how to breathe with the sword like it was an extension of thought. You will not win with strength, he told me. You will win with silence, with timing, with truth. And so I practiced, until my hands no longer shook, until I could strike before a leaf hit the ground. One dusk, while delivering fabric scrolls to the Eastern Pavilion, I saw him. Rengier, the man who promised me forever, and handed me to death. He walked past me, didn't glance, didn't stop. Why would he? I was a servant now, a widow from nowhere. But my hands tightened at my side, not with anger, with clarity. He had changed, grown colder, paler, but beneath his armor, I saw it. Guilt, fear, something fraying. Good. Let him rot from the inside, before I ever strike from without. Back in my chamber, I untied the red ribbon from my wrist, the one from the mountain, the one they thought burned, and I stitched it into my seamstress apron, hidden but present. A reminder, not of who I was, but who they created. Winter came quickly, and so did invitations. A banquet to honor Lady Mion's official ascension, a masked ball for nobles and servants alike. The Empress placed one in my hand. You'll be there, she said. You've earned the mask. I met her eyes. I don't intend to wear it long. She smiled. And somewhere in the distance, the snow began to fall. The palace prepared for celebration. I prepared for war. Snow blanketed the courtyard in white serenity. But beneath that soft hush, something sharp was stirring. Not in the guards. Not in the nobles. In me. Because revenge is not a scream. It is a rhythm. A slow waltz toward reckoning. And tonight, I would take the first step. The hall gleamed like a dream. Gold leaf pillars, mirrored walls, lanterns floating like stars. Guests wore masks of peacocks, tigers, dragons. Feathers hid secrets. Paint concealed intentions. I wore no jewels. No ornaments. Only a white silk mask with a single crimson stroke down the center. A wound made visible. It was the Empress's design. Let them wonder, she had said. And they did. Eyes followed me as I moved through the crowd. No one knew my name, but everyone felt my presence. Even them. Especially them. Mion arrived late, draped in lavender. Her mask shaped like a butterfly, fragile, false. She smiled too much. Her eyes moved too quickly. Rengier walked behind her like a shadow, too heavy to carry. I watched them. They didn't recognize me. Of course they didn't. Grief had reshaped my face. Training had reshaped my body. But more than that, rage had rewritten my spirit. I no longer moved like the daughter they killed. I moved like the reckoning they never saw coming. When the fourth song played, I approached the dais to serve wine. My steps were deliberate, silent. The Empress caught my eye for just a breath. Then she shifted the flower on her sleeve, from left to right. That was the signal. I bowed, and began. The next piece was a paired dance. Old custom. Servants and nobles alike were randomly matched. When the Empress's attendant announced the partners, the hall stirred. Lord Rengier Yen, with Lady Lin Shuang. The crowd murmured. An unknown widow, dancing with a general? A scandal. A curiosity. But no one protested. Because when the Empress commands, the palace obeys. He offered his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, familiar, but his eyes searched mine for something he couldn't name. You dance well, he murmured. As do you, my lord, I replied, voice light. He didn't know it yet, but I had memorized his every gesture. I had once loved the rhythm of his breath. Now I used it to time his downfall. We moved in a circle. Steps practiced. Phrases exchanged. Then I leaned in just enough and whispered, "Some ghosts wear skin, my lord." His fingers twitched. He missed a step. And in that half-second, I saw it.
Fear.
As the dance ended, he turned to offer the closing bow. But I pressed a paper into his hand, a scroll no bigger than a coin. He tucked it away, out of instinct. And that was the trap. Inside the scroll, a list of names,
Dates.
and one phrase burned into the parchment. I remember everything. Later that night, he entered a private chamber, likely to read the message. I followed unseen, and through a hidden panel, I watched his hands tremble as he unrolled the scroll. He stumbled back, whispered my name. "You, Lien." His voice cracked, and for the first time, he didn't look like a general. He looked like a boy who set fire to his own home, and finally saw the ashes. Rengier didn't return to the hall. Instead, he sent a courier.
To Mion.
I followed her as she slipped away from the party. She found him pacing. Their voices hissed in the snow. "She's dead." Mion snapped.
I saw her, he said.
I danced with her. Her eyes. "You're losing your mind." She left proof. Names. The ledger. That's when her voice cracked too. "You swore it burned." He grabbed her arm. "You said the body was gone, that she'd never rise again." She shoved him, and in that moment I saw it, their unity unravel. Cracks, born not of guilt, but fear. They were beginning to destroy each other, and I hadn't even raised my blade yet. Back in my chamber, I lit a candle and dipped my brush in crimson ink. I wrote a single invitation, not to Mion, not to Rengier, but to the House of Jean. The snake has seen the ghost. The deer begins to run. It is time to bring the frost. I sealed it and let the wax harden like blood. They tried to burn me, erase me, scatter my memory like ash on the wind. But they forgot. Ash still settles, and from it roots grow, stronger, colder, hungrier. I was once the flame they feared might rise. Now I am the frost they cannot see until it's too late. Because when I died, I left behind something more dangerous than vengeance. I left behind a silence that could freeze the very soul. And it had finally begun to spread. The House of Jean did not deal in whispers. They dealt in truth sharpened to knives. The Empress arranged the meeting. At midnight, beneath the black pine grove outside the western wall, I stood waiting, cloaked in silence. Jean Hyen arrived with no guards. No blade. Only a letter and a glance. "You survived," he said simply. I nodded. "I no longer bleed," I replied. "Only strike." He studied me, his eyes unreadable, then handed me a scroll. Signed. "The North supports your claim. With one condition. When the time comes, do not hesitate. Take everything." I took the scroll, and the weight of it settled across my spine like armor. Within the palace walls, Mion grew restless. She ordered new locks, changed servants, sent coded letters to unknown parties. But her control slipped like sand through a sieve. Rengier no longer trusted her. His once silent indifference had curdled into tension. They argued now, behind curtains, in the garden, in rooms they thought were private. I was everywhere. Nowhere. The air grew colder around them, and they didn't even know why they couldn't breathe. I left him another message. Not words. A strand of red silk tied around the hilt of his old training sword. He found it in the Eastern Pavilion's archive. Alone. And that night he shattered. He went to the Empress. Demanded answers. She gave him none. But I was watching. From behind a screen, I saw him fall to his knees. "I loved her once," he whispered. "She trusted you," the Empress replied, calm as winter. "You turned her into a memory. And now the memory walks." He left with his hands shaking. And I knew his soul had already begun to die. I stood beneath the plum tree. The one that never bloomed in winter. The one where he first kissed me. Where Mion once gave me a bracelet as children. Where we were whole before ambition ruined everything. I brought a single blossom from the mountains. Frozen.
Preserved.
and buried it beneath the tree. "This is yours now," I whispered to the girl I had been. "Rest here. I'll take it from here." The wind didn't answer, but I felt lighter. Word spread of a northern alliance forming. Tension thickened. The emperor grew distant. The court watched every move the empress made. And she smiled like a woman with the game already won. I continued to sow by day, train by dusk, spy by midnight, each step calculated, each whisper gathered, until I had everything: the map, the keys, the proof, and the will. At the Empress's winter banquet, I was placed near the musicians. Invisible, but I watched Mion enter in emerald silk, watched Rengier trail behind her like a shadow drained of light. Then, just as planned, the Empress announced a performance. One I had written. A masked tale about a noble lady betrayed by her kin, left to die, and reborn in snow. As the dancers moved, the story unfolded, and the entire court began to murmur. Rengier's hands clenched. Mion stood frozen. And I stood unseen. But I felt it. The room shift. The doubt settle. The truth take root. 3 days later, the emperor summoned Rengier for inquiry. Mion was denied entry to the throne room. The empress placed me outside the chamber, scrolls in hand, head bowed. I wasn't there to serve. I was there to watch. When Rengier emerged, his face was ashen. And he no longer looked like a general. He looked like a man trying not to drown. That night, I slipped a final letter beneath Mion's pillow. It read, "Do you feel it now? The snow under your feet? It was never fire you should have feared. It was me." In her scream, I heard it. The unraveling, not of a woman afraid, but of a woman who finally realized. She hadn't won. She never had. I stood once more on the cliff where they pushed me, now dressed in white robes lined with silver. The house of Jin's army waited below. The Empress's banner raised behind me. The sky split with snow. And I whispered, as I drew the blade sheathed at my back, "You tried to burn me, but I buried you in ice. And now, I come to claim what's mine." Ghosts don't wear crowns. They haunt shadows, whisper through walls, fade into the quiet. But I am not that kind of ghost. I do not drift. I do not fade. I rise. They tried to erase me from the scrolls, from memory, from the empire itself. But I returned, not as the girl they loved to betray, but as the woman they forgot to fear. And this time, I carry more than silence. I carry power. Snow fell like ash as I entered the imperial court, this time not as a servant, nor a whisper, but under full escort from the northern banners. The marble floors echoed beneath my steps. Heads turned, fans lowered, eyes widened, because no one could deny what they saw now. Me, Lady Yu Lian, alive, clothed in silver silk stitched with ice phoenixes, hair braided with obsidian pins, a scroll in one hand, a blade in the other. The Empress stood at the end of the hall, eyes glittering like a mirror to fate. And the Emperor finally lifted his gaze. "You are," he whispered. I bowed, not low, not submissively, but like a storm gathering itself. "I am the woman your court burned, the daughter this empire buried, the ghost they thought would never speak again." I unfurled the scroll. The court fell silent. Proof of my lineage. Records of poison and conspiracy. Estate documents with forged heir transfers. Secret correspondences between Mion, Rengier, and external enemies of the throne. And, at the bottom, the seal of House Jin, the co-signature of the Empress. I did not look at Rengier as he staggered to his feet. I looked at Mion. She was pale. Her lips moved, but no sound came. "Your Majesty," I said, gaze steady on the Emperor, "I request full restoration of my name, my status, and my lands. And I ask the court to witness what treason looks like when it wears perfume." Rengier stepped forward. He was still handsome, still composed, but there was no steel in him now, only rust. "She's lying," he said. "She's using the Empress." I raised my hand. "I died once because I trusted you." I stepped closer. He didn't move. I will not die again for your comfort. I handed the blade I carried unsheathed to the Emperor's guard. And with that, my words were sealed in steel. Whispers rose. Some nobles backed away from Mion. Others trembled, suddenly remembering every time they'd turned their back on me. But the Empress stood and lifted her fan.
The court will decide, she said.
But justice will not wait forever. I turned to go, my point made. But before I reached the doors, Mion finally broke. You don't belong here, she shrieked. You're supposed to be dead. I didn't look back. I said. And now, because of you, I am more alive than I have ever been. That night, Mion's allies scattered.
2 nobles confessed.
One tried to flee the city and was arrested. Rengier stayed silent, his guilt now too loud to speak over. I received letters of apology. And 1 letter of surrender. From Rengier himself. I loved you once, but I loved power more. I don't ask forgiveness. Only that you remember I once held your hand in truth. I burned the letter in my chamber hearth. And for the first time, I slept without dreams. The Emperor summoned me again. This time, not for war. He asked me what I wanted. I answered simply. Let history say I rose. Let no girl after me bow in silence. Let the phoenix in your banners mean something again. He nodded, and in front of the court, placed a crown of frost-forged silver in my hands. Not to name me Empress. To name me Keeper of the Flame, Protector of Justice, Guardian of Lost Daughters, and High Minister of the Inner Court. I accepted, and placed the crown on my head myself. After the ceremony, I walked through the garden. The plum tree was blooming, out of season. Mion had been exiled. Rengier stripped of rank and disappeared into the provinces. I stood alone where it all began. And I didn't weep, because I was no longer mourning. I was remembering the girl who once knelt here, begging to be seen. She was gone. And in her place,
me.
As the moon rose, I wrote a final line in my journal. The crown does not sit on the prettiest head. It sits where fire could not kill, and where snow could not freeze. I closed the book, blew out the lantern, and let the silence remain, not as an absence, but as a throne. I did not want a throne. I wanted justice. I wanted truth to weigh heavier than gold, and silence to be heard louder than betrayal. But power found me anyway. Not in ceremony, not in conquest, but in the way people turned when I entered the room. Not out of fear, but recognition. Because when you rise from ashes, you do not return the same. You carry fire with you, and quietly, the world begins to warm. I was named Keeper of the Flame, but I built no fortress. I did not move into the high pavilion. I stayed in a modest chamber near the old scroll hall. No guards, no maids, no audience, only scrolls, and silence. That was how I ruled. They feared I would return with vengeance. But I did something worse. I returned with vision. Every day, I read 3 letters. Not from nobles. From women. From servants, wives, daughters. Letters smuggled through kitchen doors. Written on scraps of fabric. Some signed with names. Others with tears. I lost my place when I said no. My brother took my dowry and vanished. I speak. No one hears. I heard them. And I remembered. Once I had written in secret too. So I sent answers. Quiet ones. With solutions wrapped in silk. Coin purses delivered by cloaked hands. New laws drafted with elegant ink. And slowly, the empire began to shift. Jean Hyen arrived unannounced. No trumpets. No horses. Just snow on his sleeves and calm in his eyes. You have become quite the firestorm, he said. I poured tea. Not storm, I replied. Just flame. Placed correctly. He studied me long and still, then placed a sealed letter between us. House Jean recognizes your strength. And your silence. The North offers alliance.
Trade.
And protection. I took the scroll. My war is over, I said softly. He tilted his head. Is it? I didn't answer, because peace was never permanent, and I was no longer naive. Rengier sent one final request, a private meeting. The Empress advised against it. So did the court, but I accepted. We met in the old scholar's courtyard, empty, walled by bamboo. He knelt the moment I arrived. I won't waste words, he said. Good, I replied. I buried you. You returned, and I've lived every day since in the shadow of what I destroyed. I said nothing. He looked up. Do you hate me? I considered this. No, I said. I outgrew you. And that was the truth. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had become someone he couldn't reach. And that was enough. Mion lived in exile by the coast. Stripped of title. Stripped of comfort. She sent no letters. Asked for no pardon. But the Empress's spies said she had taken up painting.
Landscapes. Seascapes.
Faces without eyes. They asked if I wanted to send her a message. I declined. Not out of cruelty, but because I no longer existed in the world she remembered. And she no longer existed in mine. The Eastern Pavilion was returned to me. I declined. Instead, I turned it into a school for girls with sharp eyes and sharper minds. Daughters of merchants, of farmers, of soldiers. They came quietly. They learned fiercely. And I watched them grow, not into wives, but into women who could write law, forge maps, draw strategies. The very empire that buried me now learned from my memory. And it was beautiful. I planted a tree. Not a plum tree. A magnolia, my mother's favorite. The first bud bloomed white, unassuming.
Small.
But it stood tall. And I named it Resolve. I tended it myself. Watered it each dawn. Spoke to it like a child. Because even the strongest need gentleness. Especially the strong. Years passed. People stopped whispering about my return. They started whispering about my changes. New laws. Fairer trials. Land rights restored to widows. Education open to daughters. The nobles resisted. Until they realized the people loved me more than they feared them. And that was how the real kingdom was born. Not in coronations, but in kitchens, in classrooms, in tears wiped by law. I stood at the edge of the garden once more. Snow falling, tree blooming, the Empress beside me. You became everything they feared, she said softly. And everything I needed to be, I replied. She touched my arm. Do you regret not becoming Empress? I looked up.
No.
I became something rare. She smiled. And left me with the sky. I watched the clouds drift, and whispered to no one. I burned once, but now I choose which fires I keep, and I keep the ones that warm, not destroy. Once, I believed love was safety, that if I loved purely enough, no one would turn the blade. But I was wrong. Love is not safety. It is choice. It is knowing someone could wound you, and trusting they won't. Rengier made his choice.
So did Mion.
And now I make mine. The sword I once offered in loyalty now rests in my hand, not to spill blood, but to point, to mark truth, to write history, to show the world what betrayal makes of a woman who survives. The blade was never meant for ceremony. It was forged for war. Obsidian edge, thin but unbreakable, gifted by the Empress. Blessed by the North, sharpened by my pain. I wore it only once, strapped across my back as I stood in front of the Eastern Court, the same courtyard where they once held my engagement banquet, where Mion gave her first speech as Lady Yen, where I had walked, dazed, believing myself loved. Now, I stood with the imperial ministers assembled, a new decree in one hand, the sword on my back, and no veil on my face. I read the proclamation slowly. Effective immediately. House Yen shall be dissolved. All lands reassigned. Titles stripped. Their history rewritten in accordance with truth. Silence followed. Not from fear.
From awe.
Because justice had never looked like this. Not in pale robes. Not in a woman's voice. Not with a sword made of stone. But it did now. I met Rengier one last time. Not in secret. In the garden. In front of everyone.
He was thinner now.
Eyes tired. Face etched with guilt that had finally taken root. He bowed, not out of courtesy. Out of shame. You could have killed me, he said. I nodded. Yes. Why didn't you? I studied him. And I answered without heat. Because death ends suffering. And you haven't suffered enough. He flinched. I stepped closer. You will live knowing what you broke. Knowing I built something better from the pieces. I unsheathed the blade, just enough for it to catch the light. This sword once waited for your hand. Now it answers only to mine. I turned away.
And he let me go.
Because even his pride couldn't outrun my mercy. Power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. That day, 3 noblemen approached the Empress, requesting an end to my reforms. They claimed tradition. They claimed order. I stood beside her, said nothing, until they spoke my name. She has overstepped. And I simply said,
no.
They waited for more. But there was nothing else to say. Because when a woman says no, and the Empire listens, that is power enough. In spring, I returned to the mountain where I had nearly died. The villagers still remembered me. They called me Ghost Lady. Some bowed. Others placed flowers at my feet. But I knelt only once, beside the cliff where I had fallen. And I planted something. A single tree seed, given by a child in the village. Because you're strong, he said. And that was all the reason I needed. Not for vengeance. Not for legacy. But for life. 1 year later, the Empire held a new festival. To honor the women lost to silence. To mark the beginning of a new court. I stood at the center. Not in royal garb. But in my gray widow robes. The ones I had worn when I re-entered the palace. And I raised the sword one last time.
Not to strike.
To reflect the firelight. And I said, this is the sword I gave to a man I trusted. He aimed it at my heart. But he forgot. I had another. The crowd bowed. And I lowered the blade. I was offered the Empress's throne. I declined. Because thrones grow heavy. And I had carried weight enough. Instead, I founded the House of Flame. An institute for women, orphans, and scholars across the Empire. A place to forge fire, not fear. They said I was mad. But madness built the walls they tried to burn. And I rebuilt them. Stronger. Years later, Rengier died in the countryside. Alone. He left no heirs. No titles. Only a letter addressed to me. It read, you gave me a sword. I used it poorly. I only hope the world sees your steel, and not my ruin.
R.
I did not cry. But I placed the letter beneath the magnolia tree. Because even broken men deserve somewhere to rest. I walk through the palace now unguarded. Children bow. Elders nod. Women smile. And when they ask how I survived, I say nothing. Instead, I show them my hands.
Scarred.
Steady. Capable. And I touch the blade I carry still. Not because I need it. Because I earned it. Not with war. But with memory. Not with blood. But with truth. The sword I gave him now aims at no one. Because I learned to aim at first at silence. And that was always the deadliest thing in the room.